Future Now Show. Brought to you by the Club of Amsterdam.
Welcome to the Future Now Show. We're going to have a dialogue between James Dorsey and Simon Jones about two different subjects. They're going to propose each other. And James Dorsey is a senior fellow at the Rajaram School of International Studies in the Nanyang Technology University in Singapore and co-director of the Institute of Chemicals of the University of Würzburg and the author of the blog The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer. The moderator is Humberto Schwab, who is a Socratic designer, physicist and philosopher. And my whole goal is to get clearance about what are the assumptions we are working on. Thank you. And my question to James is to introduce his topics in 1 minute, please.
I think one of the questions that, or the major question that people ask themselves as they look at the Middle East and North Africa with all its conflicts, the bloodshed that is going on, is whither the Middle East. If we look back at the last 3.5 years, we've gone from the euphoria of popular revolts that seem to succeed in toppling Arab autocrats to a region that has gone back, maybe even in some cases worse than what it was prior to those revolts, as well as the widespread bloodshed, sectarian conflict, and of course the rise of the Islamic State. Most people will view this as an Arab winter or the end of that brief process of change. I would argue that it's the very beginning. Processes of change take a long time, often up to a quarter of a century. They are volatile, they are messy, and what we're seeing now, I think, is a product of both a wrong policy in terms of the major powers, and that's not just the West, but also Russia and China, which have been supporting stability, with other words, autocratic regimes, in the hope that that would keep the lid on the problems. And the product is things like the Islamic State, which is a lightning rod, because for many people there really is no alternative. Just to round this up, I just came back from a conference yesterday of Arab human rights groups in Casablanca, Morocco. These groups are really on the defensive. They're under severe pressure, threatened with arrest and with other forms of retaliation and repression. And one of the things I think we can do, beyond trying to pressure for different policies on the parts of governments, is support groups like this.
Well, that's a lot of loading introduction to the topic. Let's see that we basically focus on your proposal that it's the beginning. And it's not the end. It's not the end of the process, but it's the beginning. Simon, would you give a first reaction, please?
Okay, I think the Middle East is probably characterized by a number of regions. I don't think it can be seen as a homogeneous whole. I think the pressures and the analogies of the Arab Spring perhaps can be considered in a more nuanced way. This isn't really a revolution in the traditional overthrow model. It's really seeking rights. It's much more similar to the English Bill of Rights, for example, in 1688, where people wanted defined powers, the right to own property. And the fact that relatively straightforward demands, not the overthrow of society, but the chance to own and the chance to have a fair share, the fact that these relatively modest demands have been treated as extreme options has actually played into the hands of further extremism. I don't see a short-term happy outcome for the Middle East, but fundamentally it's the society in a process of development where the rights of the individuals need to be strengthened. How and whether that is achieved within an Islamic context is another issue. But we see it in the whole issues of ISIS, and we see it at a low level with the disaffection of Arab youth in the countries of North Africa. What's going on there is an attempt to gain individual rights, although through very many different ways and in many different interpretations of what those rights should be.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you. The Middle East is, or the Arab world certainly, and the Middle East as such, is a collection of 25 plus or minus states. All of them are different, with certain sub-regions. What I do think they have in common is they are is a widespread desire across the region for change. That change is not necessarily a change that involves democracy as we would interpret it, or as Westerners would interpret it, but it is change that involves dignity, social justice, greater individual freedoms, and how those are interpreted is, or they are interpreted in various ways. The one thing that I would say is that in that sense, there are commonalities among all these different countries. The one thing that I would say is that there is a paradigm shift that has taken place as a result of the revolts, and I use the word revolts. I did not use the word revolution very deliberately, because there is a major difference. But there are commonalities, and the paradigm shift that has taken place is that for the first time, or in any case for the first time in a very long time, large groups of people have experienced what the power of the street can be. They've also for the first time questioned authority, and not just the authority of the country's leader, but authority as it has been in authoritarianism, as it has been internalized and multiplied throughout the different levels of society, government, region, province, city, village, and family. And that paradigm shift is far more fundamental than I think one realizes, even if at the moment it is perhaps less tangible or less visible in what happens on a daily news basis. But something is fundamentally changed in the region, and it will take time for that to play out.
That sounds as a profound analysis of something deeper. Can you give us an example of this paradigm shift?
I think you've got to understand the nature of Arab autocracy, and that is, and what sets it different from the experiences of dictatorship in other parts of the world. It's what a American-Palestinian scholar called in the early 1990s neo-patriarchy. And what he meant by that, Hisham Sharabi, what he meant by that was that the leader is a father figure who franchises his authority. The head of government is a father figure. The Mukhtar in the village is a father figure. And of course, the head of the nuclear family or the larger family is an authoritarian father figure. What that means is also that people identified with the leader in terms of a father figure. In fact, if you look at Egypt, for example, during the revolt in 2011, one of the key players in the revolt were the ultras, militant, well-organized, street battle-hardened soccer fans. Did not join that revolt, and some of the players and some of the officials would say, "We're not against this revolt. In fact, we share the goals, but there has to be a way in which we don't humiliate the father." And if you look at the way that Arab leaders, Mubarak, for example, or even Gaddafi in his ranting and raving, reacted to the revolts as they took place, it was the father responding to his children, almost like a father with adolescent children who doesn't quite understand where their children are coming from and what they are doing. And it was that dichotomy that was very evident if you look at the 18 days of interaction on Tahrir Square in Cairo, or what happened in Tunisia with Ben Ali, or what happened elsewhere in the Middle East.
Yeah, and you say that is now fundamentally changed. Simon, can you react on that?
Yes, I think things have fundamentally changed, and that's true. But if you take an opinion that economics drives politics, then I think you have to look at the economic drivers of these issues as well. In large parts of North Africa, in the Maghreb, traditional industries of textiles and potteries, these have been lost to a cheaper and better industry emerging out of China and Southeast Asia. In the oil-rich Gulf states, you see the vast disparities of wealth between the multi-billionaires, if not trillionaires, of the rulers of those states, and a youth which, while well cared for ostensibly in terms of education and healthcare and something, feels dispossessed in terms of access to levers of power or having their voice heard and their opinions noticed. And these economic changes, globalization with China and the rise of the petrodollars, I think are factors that you have to consider carefully as to why these things are happening and how they might be solved.
And how do you evaluate then this paradigm shift in relation to economic driving forces?
Okay, it's increasingly difficult for the states in the North Africa to compete economically. They have advantages. They have a relatively young population. Demographics, after all, is destiny. Some of them, for example, like Morocco, have reasonably good higher education systems. It's well established that a well-educated population is one of the prerequisites for economic growth, and also is usually a guarantee of social stability. So for the North Africa, the Maghreb, if you like, that investment in education, and presumably because of the lack of resources, that has to come from outside, is a core element. In the Gulf, I think you've already seen use of the petrodollars in the rise of the many universities, either local or imported from abroad, coming around. But in the long run, in a knowledge-based world, an educated population is probably a best bet for economic and social stability.
Economics is certainly a driver, without question. I think part of the problem is there's an interesting comparison to be made between the Middle East, and particularly the Gulf, and Singapore, for example, which is also in its own way an autocratic state. Singapore, in many ways, has been able to do and willing to do what Arab states have not been willing to do, which is, in terms of knowledge, empower people. Singapore today boasts one of the world's best education systems, with top universities. You look at the Gulf, there is a tremendous investment in universities, without question. There is a tremendous investment in education, but there is not really the empowerment of people to do something with that. Moreover, a lot of the revolts in the Middle East that we've seen in the last few years, or in 2011 particularly, have not been revolts necessarily of the educated middle class. They were revolts that came out of rural areas. They were revolts that came out of the disenfranchised. And disenfranchised doesn't mean necessarily here an income gap. It means a lack of any kind of economic opportunity. Huge figures of unemployment. So this wasn't a question of, I want a bigger part of the pie. This was a question, I want a share of the pie. I don't have one today. And so in that sense, I think it's again, slightly different from the classical patterns that we've seen.
Yes, indeed. Lack of empowerment is a constant a theme in the years that I've spent in the Gulf. The natives of those countries, the population, are very well provided for in education, access to jobs, and healthcare. But there's a feeling at times when you get to talk to people about being infantilized. As long as they keep quiet and toe the line and demonstrate patriotism and fidelity to the country, it'll be fine. But as soon as one starts agitating for change, which inevitably involves a transfer of power, a much more authoritarian pushback comes. It's a fundamental human desire to be in charge of their life. Okay, that's the way in which you lead a fulfilling life and just have some control over it. So this thing won't go away, and I could argue won't be bought off either, or at least not permanently. But empowered citizens in the Western model is a very different change to the political structures of those countries. We shouldn't forget how many hundreds of years it took in Europe for that change, and quite how difficult, in some cases bloody, it was to get those things established. It might be a little Pollyanna-ish to suggest that this thing will happen, that will happen in the Gulf and in North Africa overnight and without conflict.
Okay. So what are then the hopeful trends you can identify, James?
I just want to make one remark on Simon's comments. I agree with you, and I said that at the beginning. I think these processes can take 10 to 25 years. I would take issue with one thing you said, and that is that the Gulf states, the oil-rich Gulf states, have been successful in actually at least spreading some kind of wealth. If you look at the curve of Saudi GDP, and you want to, then what you will see is in 1973, when the oil boycott was declared, the United States and Saudi Arabia had a GDP each of $28,000 per capita of the population. When 2001 happened, the 9/11 attacks, the Saudi GDP had dropped to $7,900 a year. It's now up again, of course. Having said that, furthermore, you see, I lived in Saudi Arabia in 2001, and at that time, people were scratching to make ends meet. They were having 2 and 3 jobs. There are parts of Saudi Arabia that are poor.
Yes, indeed.
And there are parts of Saudi Arabia that are very wealthy. The same is true for the United Arab Emirates. Perhaps the one state that's been reasonably good at income distribution, even if it's large, but nonetheless everybody has a stake, has been Qatar. In terms of the prospects, I think what we're seeing at the moment is, of course, a fixation on groups like the Islamic State, and the solution to those kinds of groups is not. There is obviously a military law enforcement aspect to it, without question, but the solution is social and political. And without that without the social and political policies, economic, social, and other policies put in place, phenomena like the Islamic State are not going to be resolved. I mean, if we look at the Islamic State today, Al Qaeda looks nice in comparison, in relative terms. So I think one is indeed tackling fundamental problems in the region, and that takes a more middle or long-term vision rather than the short-term vision. So that takes a middle or a long-term vision. But I think that at this point, change in the region is inevitable. It's going to be bloody. It's going to be messy. It's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. But the process of change, the train has left the station in a sense.
Exactly. Okay, Simon, final shot on this?
Yes, indeed. Profound change doesn't happen quickly, rarely happens without conflict. But as James says, there's an air of inevitability about it now.
Okay, thank you. I think we agreed on the analysis. You two. That it's a fundamental economical drive in the cultural context of empowerment and individual rights, and that the economy plays a key role in this, but that's not only economy. Like Bill Clinton would say, it's economy stupid, it's also moral stupid. It's maybe both.